The rain had been falling since afternoon, the kind that doesn't bother announcing itself dramatically. It just arrives and stays, soaking through everything, patient and indifferent. I remember standing on the front porch with a garbage bag in each hand, and my father's voice still ringing in my ears long after the door had slammed shut behind me. My name is Simon Skinner. I was 23 years old, 8 weeks pregnant, and completely alone. It hadn't started as a confession. I hadn't planned to tell them at all that evening. My mother had asked why I'd been looking so pale lately, why I'd barely touched dinner 3 nights in a row, why the smell of the lamb roast had sent me fleeing upstairs with my hand over my mouth. I'd fumbled through a dozen excuses: stress at work, a stomach bug, bad sleep. But my mother had always been able to read me the way some people read weather. She knew before I finished the third lie. What I hadn't expected was my father's reaction, not the anger itself. I'd braced for that. My father was a man of strong opinions, delivered loudly and with great certainty. What undid me was how fast it came. No pause, no breath, no moment where I could see him processing what I'd told him. Just a wall of cold fury and the words, "Not under my roof, not like this." My mother cried. She always cried when he used that voice, but she didn't step in front of him. She never had. My younger sister stood in the hallway doorway with her school bag still on her shoulder and watched me gather my things in those 2 garbage bags like I was a stranger robbing the house. She was 15. I kept thinking, "Don't say anything, Lily, just let it go." And she didn't say anything. That was almost worse. So there I was, porch steps, rain, 2 bags containing roughly 1/3 of my life. My phone had 17% battery. I had $62 and some change in my wallet. The father of my child was a man named Derek who had, upon hearing the news 3 days earlier, told me clearly and without particular emotion that he wasn't in a position to be involved, and then had stopped answering my messages. I sat down on the wet steps because my legs stopped cooperating. The house across the narrow strip of road, we lived on a quiet residential lane, the kind where everyone knows each other's recycling habits, had its porch light on. It was always on. I'd noticed that over the 2 years I'd lived with my parents after graduating. The man who lived there kept strange hours. I'd see his truck in the driveway at odd times. Sometimes I'd catch him in the early morning, sitting on his porch with a coffee mug, not looking at his phone, just looking at the street. I found that remarkable. Most people couldn't sit still without a screen anymore. His name was Sam Glover. I knew that much. He'd helped her carry groceries in from the car during a winter ice storm without being asked. She'd called him a good neighbor, quiet but dependable. The kind of man, she'd said, who didn't need to announce himself. I didn't know what made me look up at his porch right then. Maybe it was the light. It cut a warm yellow rectangle across the wet pavement, and I was cold, and yellow light meant warmth, and I was out of options, and running on fumes, and 8 weeks pregnant, and sitting in the rain on my parents' front steps like some kind of discarded thing. He was there, sitting in the chair he always kept by the front door, a mug in his hands, and he was watching me. Not in the intrusive way, not the way that makes your skin prickle, just the way a person watches when they've seen something concerning and haven't decided yet whether to intervene. I think he'd been there a while. I don't know what my face was doing. He stood up, set his mug on the railing, and walked down his porch steps, across the road, and stopped at the bottom of my parents' steps. He was tall. I'd noticed that before. In the abstract way, you notice things about neighbors you never really speak to. Dark hair, broad through the shoulders, the kind of steady stillness about him that made you feel like the world had briefly stopped moving when he was nearby. "You need somewhere to go tonight?" His voice was low and even, like he was trying not to startle something. I stared at him. "I've got a spare room," he said. "No strings. You can say no." I didn't say no. He carried both bags without asking. I followed him across the road, in the rain, feeling simultaneously like the most pathetic version of myself, and somehow also like something was just barely, tentatively, beginning to be okay. His house was clean in a way that felt lived in rather than staged. Books on the shelves. A pair of work boots by the door. The kitchen smelled like something had been cooking, something with herbs, worn and settling. "Sit down," he said, nodding toward the kitchen table. "I'll get you a towel. Are you cold? You look cold." "I'm fine," I said, which was so obviously untrue that I felt ridiculous saying it. He didn't call me out on it. He just disappeared down the hallway, and came back with a large towel and a dry sweatshirt and put them both on the table in front of me. Then he turned back to the stove and stirred whatever was in the pot and said, "You don't have to tell me anything, but I'm going to feed you, if that's all right." Something in my chest cracked open a little at that. "That's all right," I managed. We ate soup at his kitchen table, a proper thick vegetable soup with bread on the side, and he didn't ask me any questions, not a single one. He talked a little about the rain, about how the street always flooded near the corner when the drains backed up, about a book he'd been reading. Easy things, things that didn't require anything from me. By the time the bowl was empty, I felt almost human again. "The spare room is at the end of the hall," he said, collecting the bowls. "There are clean sheets on the bed. Bathroom's next door. There should be everything you need in the cabinet. If there's anything missing, let me know." I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. He had calm, dark eyes, the kind that seemed to process everything but give very little away. A scar along his jaw, small and old. He looked maybe 30, perhaps 31 or 2. There was something deeply settled about him, like a tree that had grown its roots down a long way and couldn't be easily moved. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. He considered that, unhurried. "Because you needed it," he said, "and because no one should have to sit in the rain alone." I'd told myself it was temporary. I'd figure something out. A friend's couch, a cheap weekly rental somewhere, anything. My brain was already busy constructing an exit strategy, even as I lay in Sam Glover's spare bedroom, staring at the ceiling and listening to the rain on the window. But morning came, and with it, nausea so violent I barely made it to the bathroom in time. I sat on the cool tile floor afterward, cheek pressed against the cabinet, and I heard a quiet knock on the bathroom door. "Simon," his voice, steady. "There's ginger tea on the counter when you're ready. Take your time." I don't know why that made me cry. I'd held it together through the soup and the clean sheets and his careful, undemanding company. But ginger tea knocked something loose in me, and I sat on that bathroom floor and cried in a way I hadn't since the whole thing started. Ugly, relieved, exhausted crying, the kind you do when you've been holding yourself so tightly that the moment something kind happens you simply collapse. He didn't open the door. He didn't say anything else. He just waited. When I finally came out, the tea was there, hot and smelling of ginger and honey, and Sam was at the kitchen counter, reading and minding entirely his own business. He glanced up when I appeared, clocked whatever my face was doing, and went back to his book. "You can stay," he said, turning a page, "as long as you need." I sat down at his kitchen table, wrapped my hands around the mug, thought about all the reasons that was a terrible idea and a wonderful idea simultaneously. "I should tell you something," I said.
Only if you want to. I'm pregnant. It came out steady, which surprised me.
"That's why, last night, my family didn't take it well." He looked up then, met my eyes. Nothing in his expression shifted the way I'd braced for. No awkward rearranging, no sudden computation of how this changed things. "How far along?" he asked. 8 weeks. A nod. "Are you getting prenatal care?" "I had a first appointment. I need to schedule the next one." "Right." He closed his book. "Well, you're welcome here. That doesn't change anything." It was such a simple thing to say. I'd been bracing for so long, for arguments and qualifications and people reassessing whether they wanted to be involved. That simple kindness kept catching me completely off guard. I stayed. The days found their shape, gradually. Sam worked as a structural engineer. He'd often leave early in his truck and come back in the late afternoon with blueprints or site reports tucked under his arm. Sometimes he worked from home, spread out across the dining table with a laptop and paper coffee cups, and a focused silence that I learned quickly not to interrupt unnecessarily. He wasn't unfriendly. He just moved through the world at his own pace, with his own internal rhythm. And once I understood that about him, I found it oddly comfortable rather than isolating. I worked remotely, graphic design, freelance, enough to get by in ordinary circumstances. And I set up my laptop at the far end of the kitchen table, and we would sometimes spend whole afternoons in the same room without needing to speak, and it was the least lonely I'd felt in months. He cooked, most evenings. He was methodical about it. Mise en place, everything prepped before anything hit the heat. Recipes approached with the same steady precision he seemed to bring to everything. The first time I offered to help, he handed me a wooden spoon and showed me exactly what he needed done with the kind of patient, clear instruction that made it feel like collaboration rather than charity. I learned that he liked his coffee black and strong and made it precisely the same way every morning. that he had an old record player in the corner of the living room and would put vinyl on in the evenings. He had eclectic taste, jazz and folk, and occasional old soul records. That he had a cat named Orbit, a gray and ancient creature who had initially regarded me with profound suspicion, but had, by the end of the first week, taken to sleeping on the end of my bed. I learned, slowly and in pieces, a little of his story. He'd lived in the house 4 years. Before that, a city apartment, a relationship that had ended badly, a period of difficulty he referenced only obliquely and never dramatized. He had a sister he called every Sunday, a handful of close friends he seemed to see rarely but valued deeply. He asked about me too, gently, over meals, never pushing. I told him about my graphic design work, about the clients that frustrated me and the projects that I loved, about my sister Lily, who had texted me 3 days after everything happened, just 2 words, "I'm sorry," about how I'd grown up wanting to be a book illustrator and had gotten sidetracked into commercial work and sometimes missed the other thing. "Do you still draw?" he asked one evening. We were doing the dishes. He washed, I dried, a division we'd fallen into without discussion. Sometimes, sketchbooks mostly, nothing serious. I'd hesitated. Showing anyone my sketchbooks felt like letting them read my diary. But Sam had this quality, an absolute absence of judgment, a sense that whatever you showed him would be received with honesty and care. So I brought the current one down from my room and laid it on the table, and he sat with his coffee and went through it slowly and quietly. And when he finished, he closed it and set it carefully on the table and said, "These are beautiful, Simon. You should be doing this." Nobody had said that to me in a long time. Maybe nobody had ever said it in quite that way, not as encouragement or kindness, but as a simple statement of fact. By 12 weeks, the morning sickness had begun to ease, and something else had quietly begun to take its place, the growing reality of what was happening to my body and my life. The pregnancy had felt abstract at first, a fact rather than an experience. But as weeks passed, it became less abstract. The appointments, the ultrasound images folded in my jacket pocket, the way my body was slowly but inexorably changing. Sam drove me to my 12-week appointment. I hadn't asked him to. I'd been planning to take the bus. But the morning of the appointment, he'd simply appeared in the kitchen with his keys and said, "I'll drive you," in that matter-of-fact way he had, that didn't leave much room for argument, but also never felt like coercion. In the waiting room, he sat beside me and scrolled through something on his phone, and didn't try to fill the silence with false cheer. When the midwife called me in, he stood up and looked at me with a quiet question in his eyes. Did I want him to come? And I nodded, because I did, because the alternative was doing this alone, and I'd been doing so many things alone lately. When we heard the heartbeat, he didn't say anything. Neither did I. But I felt his hand find mine in the dark of that room, a brief, steady pressure, and I held on. Outside in the car park, I sat in the passenger seat and stared at the ultrasound image for a long time. Sam sat in the driver's seat and didn't start the engine. "It's real," I said finally, which I knew was obvious, but I needed to say it. "It's real," he agreed. "I'm terrified." "That makes sense." I turned to look at him. The morning sun was coming through the windshield and catching in his dark eyes and making him look, just briefly, softer than his usual contained self. "Are you okay with this?" I asked. "Being involved in all this? You didn't sign up for any of it." He took his time answering. He always did. I'd come to trust those pauses. They weren't evasion. They were just him thinking carefully before he spoke. "I didn't sign up for it," he said. "And you're right that I didn't expect it. But I don't feel like I made a mistake, Simon. I feel like—" He paused again, and something shifted in his expression, something that moved too fast for me to name. "I feel like you being here has made things better. For me. I didn't know I needed that. I didn't know what to do with that, so I tucked it away carefully, like the ultrasound image, like something I'd need to come back to and examine more slowly." My mother called it 14 weeks. I was sitting on Sam's back porch with a mug of the decaf tea I'd switched to, and the afternoon was golden and warm, and Orbit was sitting next to me, with his tail curled around his feet, and Sam was inside somewhere, and my phone lit up with my mother's name, and I stared at it for 3 rings before I answered. She cried. She'd been crying since the first word, it sounded like. She said she was sorry. She said she'd been fighting with my father. She said that Lily had refused to speak to him properly for 2 weeks, which surprised me and filled me with a fierce, complicated love for my 15-year-old sister. She said she wanted to see me. I didn't say yes immediately. I said I needed to think about it. When Sam came out with refills for both of us and found me staring at the garden with the phone in my lap, he sat down and waited. My mother called, I said. How was it? She wants to see me. She apologized. I turned the mug in my hands. I don't know what to do with that. Part of me wants to just go back, accept it, be grateful. But another part of me is angry that she let it happen at all. She could have stopped him. She never stops him. Sam nodded slowly. Both things can be true, he said. She can be sorry, and it can still have hurt you. Is it okay to still be angry at her, even if she's apologizing? Yes, he said, without hesitation. Of course it is. I exhaled. People aren't great at telling me that. Everyone always wants to push toward forgiveness as fast as possible, as if my feelings are an inconvenience that needs resolving. Your feelings aren't an inconvenience, he said. They're information. You get to feel them, and then decide what to do. I looked at him. You're surprisingly wise for someone who claims to just be a structural engineer. The corner of his mouth did something that was almost a smile. Almost. Sam smiled the way he did most things, quietly, partially, only as much as necessary. But I'd begun to find that restraint more expressive than other people's open grins. I'd begun to look for it. I met with my mother 2 weeks later, at a coffee shop in the next neighborhood, neutral ground. Sam offered to drive me, and I said I was fine with the bus, and he said, I'll drive you, in that tone that settled the matter gently and without drama, and I let him. She looked older. My mother was 51, and had always seemed ageless to me in the way that parents do, until suddenly they don't. She stood up when she saw me, and looked at my stomach, just barely showing now, a gentle rounding, and her face did something complicated and human and difficult to watch. We sat for 2 hours. She told me things about her own marriage that she'd never told me before, things that made me understand her choices more, while also making me angrier about them in a different way. She said my father had not changed his position, but that she had told him clearly for the first time what she thought of it. She said Lily wanted my number, if I was willing. I gave her Lily's share of my number. I told her I needed more time before I'd know what I wanted with her. She nodded like she'd expected that, and deserved it. On the way home in the truck, I sat quietly and watched the streets go by. That was hard, Sam said. Not a question. Yes, I said, but I think it needed to happen. He drove for a while. The radio was on low, something old and unhurried. Then, you did well. How do you know? Because you went. Because you were honest. Because you're still thinking about it rather than just putting a tidy ending on it. I pressed my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. I'm so tired of people needing things from me, I said. My parents, Derek, the pregnancy, figuring out my life. I'm just tired. Then rest, he said simply. You don't have to figure any of it out tonight. We drove the rest of the way in comfortable quiet, and I nearly fell asleep in the passenger seat. And when we got back to the house, Sam made dinner while I lay on the sofa, under a blanket with Orbit on my feet. And at some point, I realized that this unremarkable, gentle evening was the safest I'd felt in years, maybe longer, maybe ever, in a way that was entirely mine and not a product of someone else's conditional love. Something was shifting between us. I noticed it in small ways before I was willing to name it. The way he'd started putting my tea on the counter before I'd asked, timed perfectly to when I usually appeared in the morning, groggy and slow. The way he'd glance over from the stove sometimes when I laughed at something I was reading. Just a glance, not lingering, but there. The way I'd started listening for the sound of his truck in the driveway in the evenings, finding it harder to concentrate until I heard it. I noticed how, when I moved through a room he was in, there was always a small, subtle awareness of where he was. Not uncomfortable, the opposite of uncomfortable, like knowing where north was. The problem was that I didn't trust myself. I was pregnant and homeless and had recently had the sort of catastrophic personal year that makes a person cling to whoever is nearest and call it love. I knew that. I'd read enough to know that intensity and proximity create feelings that don't necessarily mean what they feel like they mean. Sam had been nothing but kind to me. That was not the same as something more. And even if there was something more, even if he felt some fraction of what I was beginning to feel, I couldn't ask that of him. A pregnant 23-year-old with complicated family dynamics and no fixed future, and someone else's baby on the way, was not anyone's idea of a low-stakes situation. So I did what I thought was reasonable. I held it carefully and kept my distance, and tried to be grateful for what existed, rather than greedy for more. That worked roughly until the night I had the nightmare. It was one of those dreams that feels entirely real. The quality of the light exactly right, the sounds too detailed to be invented. In it, I was alone in a hospital corridor, and there were people walking past, but none of them could see me. And I was calling out, but my voice produced no sound. The baby was there in my arms, but I couldn't quite look at its face, and every time I tried the light shifted. I woke up gasping, disoriented, heart pounding so hard it felt visible. It was 3 in the morning. The house was dark and quiet, except for Orbit's small snoring from the end of the bed. I lay there for a long time, trying to slow my breathing, but the residue of the dream kept clinging. The feeling of invisibility, of calling out and not being heard. I don't know what made me get up. I wasn't going to knock on Sam's door. I wasn't. But I found myself in the hallway, and then in the kitchen, getting a glass of water, and then not going back to my room. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while, and then I heard him. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in a gray sleep shirt and old track pants, hair disordered, blinking at the dark. "Simon?" His voice was rough with sleep. "What's wrong?" I didn't mean to. Go back to sleep. He ignored that. He came to the kitchen, put the kettle on without turning on the main light, opened the cupboard by feel and found the right tea, and then came and sat across from me at the table, and just waited. In the dark, with the small orange glow of the kettle's indicator, the only light. "Nightmare," I said after a while. "Bad one?" "Bad enough." "Want to talk about it?" "Not really. I stopped, tried again. I'm scared, Sam, about all of it. About doing this alone. About being a father when I can barely, when everything feels so unsettled. What if I'm not enough?" He was quiet for a moment. The kettle clicked off and he got up and made the tea without rushing, and set both mugs down and sat back across from me. "I don't think the right question is whether you're enough," he said. "The question is whether you'll try. And you will. I've watched you. The way you've handled everything since you've been here. You're not a person who gives up. You're terrified and exhausted and dealing with things that would undo most people, and you're still here. You're still trying." I stared at the mug. My eyes were burning. "What if it's not enough just to try?" I said. "Then you try differently. You find what's missing. You ask for help when you need it." A beat. "You don't have to do this alone, Simon." Something about the way he said it, quiet, plain, completely without performance, broke through all my careful keeping of distances, and I looked up at him across the small dark table, and I said, "I don't know what I would have done without you. You would have figured something out. Maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to." He looked at me then, really looked, and whatever was in his expression, I felt it land somewhere central and irreversible in my chest. "I'm glad too," he said, and he held my gaze long enough that there was nothing ambiguous about what he meant. Neither of us moved. The clock on the wall measured the silence in small, unhurried ticks, and I thought, I am going to have to make a decision about this, and I am going to have to make it honestly, without letting fear dress itself up as caution. "Sam," I said. "Yeah?" I think I stopped, started over. "There are a lot of reasons why this would be, why it's complicated, why you shouldn't." "I know the reasons," he said. "Do you? You're going to tell me you're pregnant with someone else's baby, that you've only been here a few months, that everything is uncertain, that you might be feeling things because of the circumstances rather than what they actually are." He said it without edge, simply laying it out. I blinked. "Is that not enough to give you pause?" "It gives me pause," he said. "It's not enough to change how I feel." The quiet stretched out again. Orbit had padded in at some point and was winding around the legs of my chair. "How long?" I asked. He considered. "I'd be lying if I said I noticed you for the first time that night. You've been across the road for 2 years, Simon. I noticed you." Something warm moved through my chest, tentative and enormous. "And the pregnancy," I started. "Doesn't change it," he said. If anything, he paused, and for the first time I saw him struggle slightly with the right words, which from him felt significant. "I've wanted something like this for a long time. Something real. Something that requires something of me. Not because it's easy, but because it matters." "A pregnant 23-year-old is definitely not the easy option," I said, and my voice came out slightly unsteady. "No," he agreed, and the corner of his mouth moved. "But you're not just a situation to me, Simon." He stopped. "You're you." I stood up from the table. He watched me, still, measuring. I walked around to his side of the table, and he turned his chair slightly, and I sat on the edge of the table, and we were close, genuinely close for the first time, and his hands came up and rested lightly on either side of me, on the table surface, not touching. asking. This is terrifying, I told him. Yes, I don't have any of it figured out. Neither do I. But I want to try, I said, if you do. Simon, he said quietly, I've wanted to try since you walked across the road in the rain with everything you owned in 2 garbage bags and broke my heart a little. I didn't have anything to say to that, so I leaned forward and closed the distance between us and kissed him for the first time, and he kissed me back slowly and surely, like a man who had been patient and had decided that patience had carried him as far as it needed to, and who was now, finally, exactly where he wanted to be. We didn't rush. That felt like it was both of us, by instinct, Sam by temperament, and me because I was learning to trust the pace of things that were real rather than the speed of things that were just urgent. We were careful with each other. He asked before he reached for my hand. I checked in when I thought something I'd said might have landed strangely. We talked, sometimes late into the evenings, about things that mattered and things that didn't, about our histories and our hopes and our mutual bafflement at certain aspects of the world. I discovered that he had a dry, quietly devastating sense of humor that only emerged in small increments, and that once I started noticing it, I couldn't stop. He had been in love once, properly, a few years before. The relationship had ended for reasons that were genuinely nobody's fault, a mismatch of what each of them needed, discovered too late. He'd taken a long time to recover. Not from heartbreak exactly, he said, but from the particular loneliness of having built something with someone and then finding yourself alone in the wreckage of it, uncertain which parts of the structure had been real. I understood that more than I expected to. We had dinner with his sister, Clara, at the house, 6 weeks after what I privately thought of as the kitchen night. She was a year older than him, sharp and warm, and immediately visibly suspicious of me in the way that someone who loves her brother well would be suspicious of anyone new. She watched me across the table with the kind of assessment I found myself respecting rather than resenting. By the end of the meal, she'd asked me 3 pointed questions about my plans, listened to my answers carefully, and then said to Sam, "He's sensible," with the air of someone granting a significant concession. Sam's expression was deeply neutral. "Thank you, Clara. I didn't say that to you." I liked her immensely. My sister Lily and I had been texting for several weeks by then, cautious at first, then with increasing ease. She was 15 and furious at our father, and dealing with the unique difficulty of being the one left inside a household that had done something wrong, and she needed someone to talk to. I tried to be that without putting her in the middle of adult complications she shouldn't have to carry. It was imperfect, but it was something. I hadn't spoken to my father. I wasn't ready. I didn't know if or when I would be. Sam didn't push me in any direction. He just said, "Whatever you decide, I'll support it," and meant it without any weight of opinion underneath. At 20 weeks, I had the anatomy scan. Sam came with me. He came to all the appointments now, without discussion, simply there, a steady presence at my side, in waiting rooms that I had stopped dreading quite so much. The sonographer was cheerful and professional, and moved the probe with practiced ease, and I lay there staring at the ceiling and then at the screen, and the image came into focus. The curve of a spine, the flutter of a heartbeat, the unmistakable outline of a small face, and I felt something enormous move through me. "Everything looks absolutely textbook," the sonographer said. "Beautiful scan." I looked at Sam. He was looking at the screen with an expression I had never seen from him before. Not quite awe, not quite tenderness, something that encompassed both and was quieter than either. He looked like someone encountering something that required more than he had words for. He reached for my hand without looking away from the screen. "Hey," I said softly. He looked at me then. "What do you think?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think," he said carefully, "that this is the most remarkable thing I've ever seen." On the drive home, I thought about the future in a way that didn't feel like fear for the first time. I thought about the small room at the end of Sam's hallway. My room, though the possessives in the house had been gradually, softly blurring. I thought about whether it could become a nursery, whether that was a conversation we were ready to have. I thought about what family meant when the one you were born into was complicated and fractured, and you were having to build the concept again from a different foundation. "I want to talk about something," I said that evening. We were on the back porch after dinner, the summer evening still and warm, orbit on the fence post, regarding the garden with proprietary disdain. Sam looked at me, waiting. "The baby needs a room." I said it matter-of-factly, because that felt like the right tone for it. "My room as it is could work." Or, "I've been thinking, if we..." I stopped, rerouted. What I'm trying to say is that I don't know what we are, officially, and I'm not trying to rush anything, but I want to be honest about the fact that the practical question of space and the other question of where we're going, they're starting to overlap for me, and I think they might be for you too. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I started to wonder if I'd miscalculated. Then he said, "Do you want to share a room with me?" The directness of it, characteristically Sam, made me almost laugh. "I think I do." "Then yes," he said. "I want that too." I exhaled. That was easier than I expected. "You're expecting something more dramatic?" "A little, maybe." "This isn't dramatic," he said. "I've known what I want for a while, Simon. I just needed you to know it too." I turned to look at him in the warm evening light. He had that quality of stillness that I'd come to love more than I'd thought possible. The sense of someone who had found his own ground and stood on it without needing to perform it. "I love you," I said, quietly, as simply as he would have said it. He looked at me, and the fullness of his expression in that moment was more than his face usually allowed, more unguarded and plain and uncomplicated. "I love you," he said, "Simon. I have for longer than made sense to say." I reached out and took his hand and held it in the warm evening. An orbit knocked something off the fence with a thump, and we both looked over. And Sam sighed in a deeply resigned way that was actually profoundly fond. And I laughed, and it was the simplest and most complete moment I could remember. My father called at 24 weeks. I almost didn't answer. I stared at his name on the screen for a long time, and Sam, who was nearby and saw, said nothing, just looked at me with that steady, open expression that meant, "Whatever you decide, I'm here." I answered. My father's voice on the phone was different from the voice I remembered from that night on the porch. Smaller somehow, less certain of its own righteousness. He said he'd been thinking. He said Lily had told him things, had said things to him directly that apparently had landed differently from anyone else's attempts. He said my mother had said things too. He didn't say he was wrong, exactly. My father was not constructed for that kind of direct dismantling of his own position. But he said he wanted, and his voice caught here, briefly, in a way that surprised me. He wanted to know his grandchild. I said I would think about it. I sat with that call for a week. I talked it through with Sam and with a counselor I'd started seeing, and with Lily in a long phone call that went in 3 different directions and eventually landed somewhere honest and useful. I talked it through with my mother separately. I let myself feel the anger and the grief and the cautious, unwilling tenderness that persisted in spite of both. Then I called my father back and said, "I'm not ready for things to be as though nothing happened. I need time. I need you to understand what you did, and if you're willing to do that work, actually do it, not just apologize so that things are comfortable again, then yes, we can try." He said, "Okay." I don't know what he does with that. I don't know what it becomes, but I know I said what was true, and I know that's the only foundation on which anything real can be built. The nursery took shape over 2 weekends. Sam painted it, a warm, quiet sage green that caught the light beautifully, while I sat in the doorway with a cup of tea and passed him things and made increasingly unhelpful suggestions that he received with magnificent patience. We assembled the crib together on a Sunday afternoon with a particularly incomprehensible set of instructions that Sam decoded with engineering precision, while I provided moral support and occasional sarcasm. Clara came and brought a mobile she'd made herself, hand-painted little wooden shapes on string, moons and birds and abstract forms in muted colors. She hung it up and stood back and looked at the room with an expression I recognized as satisfaction. "It's good," she said, which from Clara was effusive. Lily came to visit at 26 weeks. My mother drove her, stayed for exactly the amount of time required to be polite and not more, which I appreciated for its honesty. Lily was taller than I remembered and more herself than ever, fiercely opinionated, acutely observant, wearing a t-shirt for a band I'd never heard of, and regarding Sam with the carefully maintained skepticism of a protective younger sibling. By the end of the afternoon, she'd beaten him twice at a card game he'd underestimated her at, and he'd accepted the losses with admirable grace, and she told me, quietly, while we were in the kitchen, "He's okay. He's actually okay," which from Lily was an endorsement of the highest order. I hugged her for a long time before she left. The call came on a Monday evening in early autumn, 3 weeks before my due date, while I was reading in the living room and Sam was doing something at his desk. Not the gradual onset I'd been mentally preparing for, more a sudden, unmistakable certainty that things were beginning, that the timeline I'd been holding in my mind had just become real. Sam was in the living room within 30 seconds of my calling his name. He took one look at me and picked up the hospital bag from its spot by the door. He'd put it there a month ago, positioned it there himself after he'd checked and rechecked everything was in it, and held out his hand. Ready, he said. No, I said honestly. That's okay, he said. Let's go anyway. The labor was long. I won't pretend otherwise. It was long and difficult, and there were stretches of it where I found the edges of things I hadn't known I had. Endurance, and something underneath endurance, a bedrock of just continuing regardless. Sam stayed the whole time. He didn't try to make it into something it wasn't. He didn't perform cheerfulness or minimize what was happening. He was simply present, in that absolute way of his, holding my hand when I wanted it and giving me space when I needed that instead, and talking to the midwives with the same calm clarity he brought to everything. After a labor that had spanned the whole of the previous day and most of the night, my son arrived. They placed him on my chest, and I looked at his face, scrunched and furious and shockingly completely real, and I became someone different from who I had been. Not unrecognizably different, but different at the center, in the way that some experiences don't add to who you are, but reorganize everything already there into a new shape. Hello, I said to him, because it seemed like the thing to do. He was not impressed by my hello. He was very small and very loud, and completely miraculous. Sam was beside me, close. I looked up at him. His eyes were bright in a way I hadn't seen from him before, and his hand was on my shoulder, and he was looking at my son with an expression so undefended it made my throat ache. I'd had 3 names in consideration for months. We'd discussed them, Sam and I, without either of us making a final declaration, holding them loosely. But in that moment, looking at this particular face, one of them settled into place with the quiet certainty of the right thing. Elliot, I said. His name is Elliot. Sam squeezed my shoulder, in my ear, quietly, just for me. Perfect. We brought Elliot home on a Wednesday. In the car seat, we'd spent 40 minutes researching and had been tested by Clara, who worked in childcare and had very specific opinions about latch mechanisms. Sam drove with the particular caution of someone transporting something genuinely irreplaceable. I sat in the back beside the car seat and kept checking that Elliot was breathing, which he was, continuously, with the reliable diligence of the newly arrived. The house had been cleaned and the fridge had been stocked. Clara's doing, I discovered. The nursery smelled of the lavender oil I'd been diffusing in there for weeks. Orbit appeared in the hallway, regarded the carrier with the expression of a deity encountering an unexpected development, and then retreated with dignity. Sam made tea. Of course he did. We sat in the living room in the afternoon light, Elliot asleep on my chest, and Sam on the sofa beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched, and everything was very quiet and very still. Thank you, I said after a while. Sam looked at me. For all of it, I said. The night it started. Every morning in between. Being there last night. This, I gestured at the room, the house, the life that had accumulated quietly and steadily around me over the past months. I don't have the right words for how much this has meant. He was quiet for a moment, looked at Elliot's sleeping face, then at mine. I keep thinking, he said slowly, about what my life looked like before you came across that road. And it wasn't bad. I wasn't unhappy, but there was a kind of absence. Like a room where the furniture is arranged correctly, but the windows haven't been opened in a long time. I waited. You opened the windows, he said simply. I thought I might come apart at the seams, in the best possible way. I pressed my face briefly against the top of Elliot's small head and breathed, and then looked back at Sam. I think we should make this official, I said, eventually. Not right now, not with any rush, but I want you to know that's what I want. He smiled, not the half smile I'd cataloged over months of watching, a full one, unhurried and genuine, transforming his face in a way that still caught me off guard. I've been wanting to say the same thing for a while, he said. I was waiting for the right moment. Was this not the right moment? A newborn on your chest and hospital bag still by the door? He considered. It's not the most conventional. Nothing about any of this has been conventional. No, he agreed, but it's been right. He reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair back from my face, a gesture so natural and familiar that it felt like it had been his for years. It's been exactly right. Elliot is almost 1. He has very strong opinions about mashed banana and crawls with extraordinary speed toward anything he's specifically been told not to approach, which suggests a personality that will keep everyone around him on their toes. He says several versions of things that might be words. Sam is convinced that what Elliot has been saying to Orbit for the past month constitutes genuine interspecies communication. My mother comes on the first Sunday of every month. She and Elliot have the kind of relationship that exists entirely between them, outside of the complications of the adult world, and I try to keep it that way for both their sakes. My father came to Elliot's almost birthday dinner last month and sat at Sam's kitchen table and was quiet in a way that felt like effort rather than distance, which is not nothing. We are nowhere close to where we might have been, but we are somewhere. I choose to count that. Lily is 16 and is planning to study environmental science, which seems exactly right. She visits when she can and is Elliot's devoted, slightly chaotic aunt, in practice if not yet in legal terminology. Sam has quietly become the big brother she wished she had, which I observe from a careful distance because I refuse to be undone by how good it is. Clara is planning to move closer. This is either wonderful or a very significant commitment of mutual patience, possibly both. Sam and I are engaged. He asked me on a Saturday morning in the kitchen, with Elliot on his hip and coffee going and Orbit underfoot, and no particular fanfare. He just slid a ring across the table toward me and said, "I've been carrying this around for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. This is the right moment." And it was, because the right moment wasn't an extraordinary one. It was a completely ordinary one, full of the ordinary things that had become, quietly and without my fully noticing, the architecture of everything I loved. I said yes before he finished the sentence. There is a thing I have thought about often in the past year, the question of what saves a person. The big dramatic interventions, the clean narrative rescue, those exist, sometimes. But more often what saves a person is something small and sustained. A porch light that happens to be on. A bowl of soup offered without conditions. A man who sits across a dark kitchen at 3 in the morning and says, without any performance or calculation, that you are not alone. I was 23 and pregnant, and standing in the rain with everything I owned in 2 garbage bags, and a family that had chosen its own comfort over me. And I was terrified in a way that went all the way down. And the thing that changed wasn't some grand reversal. It was a person who looked at all of that and decided simply that he was going to show up, day after day, for no reason except that he could, and because something in him recognized something in me, and because kindness, true, unsentimental, unglamorous kindness, is an act of will as much as anything else. Sam will roll his eyes at this characterization if he reads it. He will say that he just did what seemed obvious, and that I'm making it more than it was. He minimizes his own goodness in the way of people who are genuinely good, and therefore don't consider it remarkable. But I was there. I know what it meant. Some things begin in rain and garbage bags and a stranger's porch light. Some things become everything. This did. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story. And if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me.